So yeah, we hope that you guys enjoyed your little break, or if you were able to check out the language lesson, if you learned a couple things, Spanish and French. Um, and so we're back with a few more talks. So we have Gabriel Wyner, who is the CEO and founder of Fluent Forever. He's also a best-selling author, an opera singer, and a polyglot who's based in Chicago. After learning 4 languages in under 2 years, his book, Fluent Forever, How to Learn a Language Fast and Never Forget It, became a national bestseller. And so in this talk, Gabriel will deliver a humorous take on why children are better than us at learning. At the root of this is a myth that children learn faster than adults, which is in fact far from true. So I will go ahead and leave you to it.
Thank you so much. Apologies for the sudden running off to fix my robot vacuum. Hi, everyone. Today, I mostly wanted to talk about the central challenge from how I look at it in terms of language learning, which I think a lot of people will have different opinions as to what that would be. People sometimes are like, well, the problem is that we're adults and we've lost the ability to learn languages. No, like if you start looking at the data, that one starts showing you that actually adults learn languages faster than kids. There are some people who start looking at this and saying, hey, it must be grammar, it must be pronunciation. And like all of these aspects, they are legitimate challenges when it comes to learning languages. But the ultimate central challenge to learning languages, from my standpoint, ends up being memory. This idea of not forgetting language is, I think, central to everything that we do. The problem is not that we're adults. The problem is that we have no time. The issue is that when you are learning a language for a few hours a week, then you have more and more time for your brain to forget things, and we will always be forgetting things. And so as adults, the main thing we need to deal with is memory. And to that end, what I want to jump into is, well, what is memory, in fact? And what does it look like? What does it feel like to have solid memories? What does it look like to have really shallow memories that will sort of depart our heads really rapidly? And for that, I want to jump into this example of a cookie because I like cookies, and that seems like a good place to start. So when I talk about cookies, there's a number of things that are going to happen in my brain that will happen in all of our brains to some extent. Memory, as it turns out, is not really located at any particular spot in your brain, but it ends up being something that branches across areas of your brain. So if I show you this picture of a cookie, there's aspects of your brain in terms of processing the visual of that thing that will light up. But that is not a memory. And there's if you smell a cookie, there's parts of your brain that will light up in terms of response to that smell. This is just response to stimuli. That isn't in fact a memory. When you eat it, that taste, same deal, things light up. That's not a memory either. The sound of the word cookie, the emotions you might feel when you're eating a cookie, you might feel really good. None of those individual things are a memory, but the connections between them are. There's this law called Hebb's law that was coined, that neurons that fire together wire together, which is to say that if I see this image of a cookie, if someone shows a cookie to me and then I eat it, and I have that taste in my mouth at a similar time as to when I saw it, those two things, because they're active at the same time, they're going to interconnect. And now that is in fact a memory. If I'm smelling this thing, which is closely linked to taste, and I'm smelling it at the same time as I'm tasting it, and I'm actually like seeing this thing, all of those pieces are now going to interconnect because they're all active at the same time. If the first time I encounter a cookie, I'm 3 years old and my parents are like, hey, do you want a cookie? And they say the word cookie, and then I eat it and I have that sensation in my mouth and I smell it and I see the thing that they were giving me, then all of those things are now interconnected. And if at the same time I have a good feeling, because freshly baked cookies from my parents, the first time in my life, like all of those things will wire together in a way that is nearly unforgettable. And if I tell an English speaker, let's say learning German, that, oh, the word for the German word for cookie is Kekse, that new English speaker, that speaker learning German, they have none of these associations built into the word Kekse. All that I've really done is I've told them the sound of a word. I've like the thing that are active in their brain at that time is the sound of the word cookie, because I'm like cookie, and kekse are the same thing. And the only thing that's active for them are not tastes and smells and emotions, but rather just the active sound in their head, cookie, and the active sound in their head, kekse. And so those two things will wire together. They will form a memory. But when you compare the depth of that memory to the one that I have for cookie, it's night and day. It's this super shallow, shallow memory for them. And so there, this shows us one of the key challenges when it comes to learning languages, which is that how do you get deep memories into a new language? How do you make kekse have depth to it? And there's two parts of that discussion in terms of really making a language memorable and stick long term. And one of those has to do with this depth question, which is what most of this talk will be about, which I'll lives in this framework called levels of processing. And then the other aspect is, well, when do you repeat this? Because everything is ultimately forgettable. You can forget your native language, honestly, if you live in a country for long enough where you don't speak it. And so you do need to repeat things, you need to review things, and there are really efficient ways to do that that live under spaced repetition. We'll talk about that briefly. There's not enough time for us to go into the full depth there, but it's an important part of the discussion, so I want to give that a few minutes as well. But levels of processing will be where we live for the most part. And the levels of processing framework, I think, is fascinating, and it comes out of the 1970s, where a bunch of cognitive psychologists were looking into basically how many tests can you give college students because they're cheap to pay. You just give them pizza and they'll do things for you. And so there's a ton of memory research coming out of the 70s on college students, and this one was a really nice test, a really beautifully designed test, where they created a list of words that were 1 or 2 syllables long, very concrete, bear, apple, pear, water, that were things you could see and you could touch. And they randomized the list, and then they randomized 4 types of questions that they would ask students about this list. And so they would ask students sometimes about the structure or spelling of the word. So they'd ask, okay, well, how many letters are in the word pizza? How many letters are in the word bear, etc. They would sometimes ask about the sound of the word. So does bear rhyme with pear? Does apple rhyme with pear? Things like that. They would ask about the concept. So does bear have a tail? Does apple have a tail? Is student a type of fruit? Things like that, where you really have to grapple with, well, what is this thing? And then they would sometimes ask things about personal connections. So do you like bears? This would often happen with adjectives. They would ask things like, are you green? Are you sad? Are you big? Things like this, where you have to not just grapple with what does the word mean, but, well, how does that meaning connect to me? Then they would distract the students for a little while. And afterwards, they would give them this surprise memory test where they said, hey, forget all the questions. What are the words we asked you about? Did we ask you about bears? Did we ask you about apples? Did we ask you about peaches? Like, what did we ask you about? And they got really predictable results, really consistent results across all of these students. What they found is that it doesn't matter that the word itself is concrete and visual. It matters what you ask about it. So if I ask you about the spelling of bear, this structural concept, you will generally forget it within a few minutes. Structure is kind of uninteresting. If I ask you about the sound of a word, does bear rhyme with pear? Now that's a little more deep. You remember about twice as many words if I ask you that question. And if I ask you about the concept, does bear have a tail? Now that starts becoming something you really do remember. Students would remember twice as many concept questions or the words that were that had concept questions associated with them compared to the sound questions, and 4 times as many as the structure questions. And then last, if I ask you about personal connections, do you like bears? Have you ever seen a bear? Then students would remember actually 50 to 100% more. This test topped out. Once you get past 90, it's hard to keep going. But in some other studies, you would see another doubling of how much you would remember if we ask you personal things. Levels of processing, as it turns out, is our filter. It's what helps us not go crazy in the world. Because if you go to the grocery store and you go through the aisle of 100 brands of deodorant, you don't want to memorize every single word you see, every single name, every brand, all that stuff. You don't want that. And your brain realizes this is useless information. Let's filter it. Similarly, if every time you heard something, you immediately memorized it. You listen to a podcast and suddenly you can repeat the whole podcast verbatim. Like, that sounds good. It's actually terrible. There's some people who will store information like this. It's crazy making. We need a filter to tell us what is important and worth memorizing versus what is not. And this is our filter. And so just sounds, can you hear it? Is below the level of that filter. It's something that our brains will say, if people are just saying stuff, like, let's get rid of that thing. But if people are saying stuff and the concept matters, if I want to, if it's caught my attention enough for me to think about what it really means, you know, are bears a threat in your area? Well, now I need to think about, are bears a threat in my area? I should actually think about what bears mean. Like, what does that mean? And especially to me, this personal connection aspect is like the most concepty of concepts. It's the concepts that aren't just concrete. It's not just something that makes me think about what it is, but makes it think about all of the ramifications of what it means to me. And all of this ties back to that concept of the cookie thing, which is that our brains are lazy. They're designed to be. It's efficient. And they will think as little as need be. And so if I ask you about the number of letters in the word bear, then okay, I'm just going to think about a few symbols that I see on a page. If I ask you about whether it rhymes with pear, then I'm starting to actually think, okay, well, what do those symbols do? More aspects of my brain start lighting up. If I ask you about the number of legs on a bear, well, now I have an image in my head. So now the image center and the sound of the word, all these things are starting to connect. And if I ask about, whether bears are a danger in my area, now I need to think about my area. I need to think about bears. I need to think about, teeth and claws, and all of that stuff starts lighting up. And so the memory becomes much deeper. This has a lot of consequences in terms of language learning. You see, like, if I am attempting to learn, let's say, Japanese or Mandarin, and I see this symbol, and I'm told that this symbol is the Japanese character for cat, but I don't even say the word out loud, and I just say, good luck, memorize that thing. If you don't have exposure to this character set, you are pretty screwed. This is going to be very difficult to remember. I mean, this is just a bunch of lines to most people. It gets a little bit better if I'm teaching an English speaker, let's say Russian, and I'm like, this is the Russian word for language. But again, I don't say the word out loud, so we're still living exclusively in structure. It's a little better only because I can look at this and be like, oh, well, I kind of know those symbols. I guess this is a backwards R, it's like a 3, that must be a lowercase b and a capital I, and a K. Like people can make references to things they already know, even if they're wrong. And that will help them store a little bit more. And so the new English speaker who is trying to learn either of these languages will have a terrible time with Mandarin and a slightly less terrible time with Russian in terms of holding on to words like these without the sounds associated with them. But like, this is pretty rough. You're not going to remember this stuff. Slightly better is, okay, well, here's my email password, 3QH ampersand PLY. But again, this is purely structure. And even if it's structure in a familiar alphabet, it's really not memorable. So we're not in good territory yet at all. We're just not in completely terrible territory right now. If we get to sound, what you'll find is there is a continuum in sound. So I could tell you that the Hungarian word for camera is fénykép. And that is a sound, and I've just associated now the sound of the word camera, sound of the word picture. Camera's fénykép as you Gabe. I didn't have space for that one. The word image with fénykép, but like so image, the sound of that word, and fénykép, the sound of that word, are both now associated for you. But because fénykép is composed of sounds that you're not familiar with, this word isn't really going to be a clear association. Whereas if I told you that the Martian word for image is maktor, and you were very familiar with the sort of American accent, and that was like a good construct for you. You knew that set of sounds. Then that would be easier to remember. And so this is where language learning classes tend to live. When you go to at least translation-based classes where people tell you things like, maktor is the word for camera, or word whatever, those sorts of word pairings, these translation-based word pairings, these are sound associations. And so they don't stick very well. There's an interesting phenomenon in this idea of the spectrum between Fenyikibe and Moktor, where the worse your teacher's accent is, the more it matches your native language, the easier that teacher will be to remember, even while they're teaching you the wrong information. Because you learning the wrong accent's actually not going to help you long term, but it will be easier to remember. So that's an interesting like feature of this. But we're still not in good territory. Sound is not very memorable. And so what we need to do is get past sound. We need to actually start thinking in concepts. And again, even concepts have a range. There are abstract concepts and concrete ones, and abstract ones are also a little harder to remember, but still easier to remember than just sound. So if I tell you that my birthday is in June, well, that really means something. That's a time of year. You might have associations with like it being warm in June if you're in the northern hemisphere, things like that. And so you can grapple with concepts and you can say, okay, what about the concept of a cat? Like that's a real thing. But as we saw earlier with that test on college students, just having words that are concrete or abstract, like that's not enough. We need to get us to think about what they mean. And one way to do that is to ask you questions about, how long is the month June, or how many legs are on my cat? But there's a trick, and that trick has to do with images. If I show you this image of a cat, and I say, this is gatto. This is the Italian gatto, and I don't even use the word cat. You're not going to look at this image and say, oh, 5 letters. You're not going to, look at this image and say, oh, that rhymes with matto, something like that. You got to think about a cat. Like that's the thing that goes meow. That's the thing that has a tail. Like images are very, very powerful when it comes to memory. And there are these again tests in the 70s that sort of show this, where you have college students again, locked in rooms, getting shown images where they tried to see, hey, what is our retention for images generally? In this set of studies, they took college students, they flashed images on a screen at a rate of 1 every 3 seconds. And then they did this for multiple hours. They showed the students 550 images, came back the next day and quizzed them showing 2 images, and then saying, hey, which of these images did you see yesterday? And you would think that your accuracy would be pretty good, but I would not have expected that the average accuracy on that test was 98.5%. Really, really high. And so they tried to see, okay, well, that's a very high number. What happens if we expand the number of images to 3,000, hours and hours and hours? What if we expand it to 10,000, which they eventually did? This is 5 days in a row, 8 hours a day of just image, image, image. And after 5 days of this torture, they quizzed the students on which images they remembered, which of these 2, and they found again the accuracy was above 80%. We have almost limitless capacity when it comes to remembering images, and it's because of levels of processing. It's because this stuff is so concrete that it makes us think about what it all really means. And that seems like that's neat, but not very useful for language learning, because we're not just memorizing images. We're trying to memorize words. And so the question becomes, well, what happens when you put a word next to an image? And fortunately, it turns out that's even better than images alone. If you stick an image next to a word, what your brain will do automatically is it'll try to figure out what are the connections between those 2 things. And so more parts of your brain will light up, and then they will interconnect and they'll form a deeper memory. If I stick a box with some lines coming out of it, I put it next to the word apples are, the phrase apples are delicious, those have nothing to do with each other. Boxes with lines coming out and apples are delicious, there's nothing there, but your brain will try to make something there. We'll try to say, well, are the lines like the flavor of the apples? Like, why did that author do that? And in battling the lack of connection between these 2 things, it will form connections between those 2 things. And so an image like this, where you have this cat, this picture of a cat next to gatto, that will form actually a relatively deep memory. And you can get even further than that if you start adding in personal connections. If I put my childhood cat's name, Lily, next to an image of a cat, next to the new word gatto, that's going to form something that really, really can start sticking. And so we can trick our brains into going into deeper and deeper levels of processing as long as we're careful about it, as long as we're doing it really intentionally. And so this informs kind of what we want to do with language learning, how we can start having deeper memories there. Nonetheless, this stuff is going to just vanish over time if we don't do anything with it. We can have a really, really deep experience with a word or a phrase or a grammar rule that has personal connections and imagery associated with it and makes us really think, how do I feel about that grammar? All of that. But if I never repeat it again, it will eventually fade. And so while I won't get into all the depth of spaced repetition, the basic idea is this. When I show you information, I tell you, for instance, the Hungarian word for picture is fénykép, and I say a thing that I gave you earlier. I'm doing you a disservice. If instead I ask you the question, what does fénykép mean? That's going to give you about 5 times more return on your time. It's going to ingrain that word in your head much, much more, 5 times more, than me simply telling you that information a second time. And the reason for that is that every time I practice reaching back into my memory and finding something, hey, what does fénykép mean? You have to go back, maybe not very far back, maybe it's just right there where you're like, image, got it. That reaching back is the actual action of memory, of memorization. That's the rehearsal process. That's the thing. That's the strength training. That's you going to the gym. Is this reaching back and finding what does fénykép mean? And like in the gym, where you can increase, the heaviness of something and get more gains, but only up to a point where you increase the heaviness so much you can't even lift it. Then you stop getting the gains. Same thing happens with memory. So me asking you to reach back, just a little bit is not as valuable as me asking you to reach back a lot. So if I ask you, hey, what does fénykép mean? And you're like, picture. And I'm like, okay, what's fénykép mean? And you're like, picture. I just said that 3 seconds ago. That test isn't super valuable. But if I wait, let's say we waited 10 minutes and then I was like, hey, do you still remember what fénykép means? And you're like, picture. Those couple of seconds of me reaching are heavier weights. And what spaced repetition does, which you'll find in all of these sort of flashcard programs like Anki, I would say about half of the companies out there using flashcards in some format are using spaced repetition. What they're aiming to do is make sure that those tests involve a lot of reaching. What they're aiming to do is make sure that we've taken the information in whatever format we're doing, whether that be translations that we're just doing the sound comparisons, or that's images and emotions and all that stuff, whatever the form of information. The goal is, can we make you reach for it? And can we make you reach for it with like enough weight behind it that it actually allows you to retain that information long term? So that'll be all that we'll have time for today, because I want to save some time for Q&A. So let's do some Q&A.
Awesome. That's super interesting. We had a lot of great feedback in the chat as well. And we do have some questions for you. So the first question is regarding remembering with pictures. So the question is, what about different types of learners? For instance, not everybody is a visual learner.
In the studies of our visual memories, what the studies tend to show is that human memory for visuals is really, really good regardless of your learning style. That's obviously not going to be true if you're blind, and so there's workarounds for that where you start moving towards things like sound effects and stuff like that. But generally, because of how levels of processing works, even if you are a super auditory learner, like that's a bonus. That means that you will pull in more auditory stuff, but it doesn't mean that you are somehow then hampered from remembering visual content. And so visual content is not about how artistic are you. Like I'm mostly colorblind. My memory for colors and stuff is really crappy, honestly. Like there've been times where I've tried to use mnemonics that are like color based, where I'm like, red things are going to be conjugated in this way and blue things are going to be conjugated that way, and I've forgotten it all because my color memory is crap. but nonetheless, I can't not think in concept. I can't jump to that third level of I can't avoid jumping to the third level of processing if there's an image in front of me. It's just it's how our brains work
Mhm.
in all cases, unless you're blind, and then
Great.
the auditory stuff starts jumping in.
Totally. Okay, next question here. So, how do you balance depth of processing with friction or burden to study? In self-study, one can spend hours doing mindless, useless tasks. Depth is more useful, but can also be more tiring.
Um, I think what you try to find are what is going to sustain your interest. So yes, I can go into a word and I can say, man, this word is so interesting. I want to look at the dictionary entry for this word. And then you see the dictionary entry for this word, and you find, and I'm looking, let's say, in Japanese, and so I see all these, meaning the dictionary entry is in Japanese, and I see 4 new words in the dictionary definition. I'm like, those are cool words. I'm going to go into those and learn those too. And you can keep going, and I can spend an hour researching one particular word, and I never got to the end of the first sentence I was trying to learn. Um, if that endeavor gets me excited, it's worth doing. Excitement and interest are things that actually stir memory even more. And so, me getting lost in this rabbit hole about a particular word, like that's actually, as long as I'm having fun, that is worth doing. If I'm getting 30 minutes into this 60-minute rabbit hole and I'm like, God, I hate this, but I just have to get to the bottom of it, then yeah, you want to have some rules for yourself that say, okay, like here, I'm going to set a timer. I can play with this word for 15 minutes and then I need to move on. So
Mhm.
it is really about monitoring your own interest. And this is where differences in learning styles are super important, because for one student, delving into that thing for hours is going to be the right call because they're super engaged. And for another student, it's going to be just a nightmare. And so that's where the personalization thing is really important.
Yeah, definitely. And so, how do you go about the memorizing with pictures when you're trying to learn a lot of languages?
I make sure I stick to one at a time. I think that language interference is not just real, but like very painful. And you avoid it most by saying, hey, if I'm going to spend hundreds of hours of my time on a particular language, and or on 4 languages, then I might as well spend the first few hundred hours on one language and then the next few hundred language hours on the next language, because if I do them overlapped, it's actually going to make my time less efficient in both languages. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I focused on one at a time, and I also make sure that when I'm searching for images, I'm searching in the target language, so that I can see the surprises. I can find where the associations with a particular word are not what I would have expected, and therefore get these moments of excitement where I'm like, whoa, that wasn't what I
Yeah.
thought it was going to be. Let's store that.
Oh, interesting. Good tip. Do you have any tips or tricks for learning and remembering words or phrases that don't translate into your mother tongue? How do you create a personal connection and depth with those types of words?
So I mean, I think those are the really good ones in the sense of you being able to really they have this aspect of surprise. You're like, whoa, I never realized I could even say a concept like that. But B, people are like these phrases exist because there are situations in which you would use them. And like there's not like you can go into a phrase in Russian that you've never seen before in English and be like, I cannot even imagine why I would ever use that thing. If you're in a case where you can't imagine why you would use a phrase, then don't learn it. I mean, skip that thing. But in most cases, you're going to be like, wow, that's so cool. Like I remember learning the word like doch and eben in German, where I was like, why aren't these in English? I want these. These are making me angry that these are not here. And you can come up with ways where, like in that conversation I had yesterday, I wish I could have used that in English. This is how I would use it in German, and suddenly
Totally.
they're personal again.
Yeah, there's so many great, I think, German words and phrases that we don't have in English.
German is like it's amazing. Yeah,
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question.
sure.
So we have a fellow opera singer. How would you say music has influenced your language learning, and can this be applied to people without much musical ability? Do you still perform?
Um, I don't still perform. Opera is hard. Running a company is hard. Opera is harder. The I would say that there are tons of studies showing that musicians are better at learning languages on average than the general populace, and I don't think it's because musicians have like a magical genetic gift because you can just study to become a musician. What I think it is that musicians are trained to focus on sound and and think that sound is important. And I think with that example earlier about how like Cape is really hard to learn, but Mocktor is really easy to learn, the musicians in the group are going to notice how hard Cape is, and they're going to give it the time it deserves. And I think as long as you realize that, then you can get around the fact that you're not a musician if you're not, and just say, okay, well, musicians spend more time on sound, they do better in languages. I should spend more time in sound, and I think you can get basically all the benefits that it would be to be a professional musician.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure some people have more questions. If you're willing to stick around and chat in the chat afterwards, that would be really great. And
Sure.
people can ask you questions there. All right. Then I guess we'll drop off and then come right back for our next talk. Thanks.
Thanks
Thanks,
all.
Gabe.